Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Michael Parker of Citigroup, and I'm also Director of the Global Maritime Forum. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the Getting to Zero Coalition Blueprint report prepared by the Energy Transitions Commission. I'd like just to remind the audience about the history of the coalition. The Getting to Zero Coalition is a coalition led by the Global Maritime Forum, Friends of Ocean Action, and the World Economic Forum, and was launched during UN Climate Action Week in September last year. Seems a very, very long time ago. At the closing plenary of the UN Climate Action Summit, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, referred specifically to the Getting to Zero Coalition's initiative as one of the best examples of industry taking the initiative and the shipping industry making a really concrete move towards decarbonization and zero emission vessels. The Global Maritime Forum Summit in October last year in Singapore moved some of the items around the Getting to Zero Coalition forward, and we met as the coalition in February in Copenhagen. And as we sit here 9 months later, it's remarkable the amount of work that has happened, not just in this coalition, but obviously across the broader spectrum in shipping and elsewhere around improving climate change and the agenda. When we met in Copenhagen, you may recall that Italy and Europe was beginning to see the first wave of COVID cases, and we were all keen to ensure that there were no Italians at our meeting. Little did we really realize, I think at the time, how bad it was going to get. But I do want to point out some people who came very far to that meeting. Dr. Peter Nuttall, the scientific and technical advisor for the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport, he came all the way from Fiji. And Brett Cooper, the director of renewable hydrogen, came all the way from Australia. And those two, representing countries, if you like, have worked closely throughout alongside industry. And in the panel that my colleague Casper Søgaard will chair later, we'll have representatives of industry who've also been moving rapidly despite COVID on this agenda. A third person who came a long distance was my co-chair of the First Movers Group, Randy Chen, vice chair of One High and a vice chairman of the Global Maritime Forum. And he and I had led a discussion during the Global Maritime Forum Summit in Singapore around the importance of first movers. And we were taking lessons, if you like, and examples from the introduction of offshore wind in the UK as an example of the importance of how first movers should not be disadvantaged by the leaps they make and the investments they make. And so as we moved from the plenary session in February in Copenhagen, 120 of us, I think, roughly were at that session, we moved into the different working groups we'd volunteered to join or been volunteered to join. And Randy and I are co-chairs, as I said, of the First Mover Group. And we gathered around the flip charts to discuss what we should discuss. Almost saying, well, what do we do next? And quite quickly in our group, we came out with a number of themes. One was there are a lot of pilots around zero emission. It's important we understand what those pilots are doing and we get that message over. Transition, I think, is an important issue because the evidence of the industry lowering its emissions en route to zero emissions is also important, not just for the progress that can be made by the industry, but also for some lessons that can be learned for what zero emission means in terms of distribution and infrastructure. Now, part of the rigorous thinking around our work as a group has come from the Energy Transitions Commission. And what we're about to see is really the culmination of the first stage of that work as we will move next year into really more concrete work around the different initiatives. What I would say is I think we are all very enthusiastic and pleasantly surprised around the pace that has been made, and that maybe even given the announcements coming out of different governments, especially China and Korea and Japan and India, that actually when the UN meets in the climate change conference in Glasgow at the end of next year, in a year's time, that the agenda will have moved very far forward. And that actually, instead of worrying about protecting first movers, it'll be the late movers that will really be worried about missing the boat, as it were. So with that, I would like to hand over to someone I first met at dinner the eve of the launch of the Getting to Zero Coalition in New York, and that is Faustine Delasalle, the director of the Energy Transitions Commission, who will talk about the first wave and present a blueprint for commercial scale zero-emission shipping pilots. Over to you, Faustine.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and it's been a real pleasure and honor to work with the Global Maritime Forum and with the members of the Getting to Zero Coalition over the past 6 months to develop the blueprint that we're launching this morning. As you said, supporting first movers is really for us a priority in the journey of the shipping and the maritime sector towards net zero emissions. The Energy Transitions Commission was set up 4 years ago with that objective of really supporting industry in their transition to zero emission energy. And we have defined as our goal to help all sectors reach net zero emissions by mid-century. And for the shipping industry to reach net zero emissions by mid-century, we know that we will need to start deploying zero emission technologies very fast, very early, because assets, boats, have a long lifetime. And therefore, we need to start deploying them at pace in the 2030s if we want to have a chance to really renew the full fleet by mid-century. And so for that to happen in the 2030s, we need the technologies, we need zero-emission fuels to really be proven, both from a technical point of view and from a commercial point of view, before 2030. Hence the urgency we have to really unlock a wave of pilots across the maritime sectors, across different segments of the maritime sector, to prove those technologies at scale. So the focus of the blueprint that we've developed is really on how do we unlock the first wave. Not the first wave of technology pilots, because those already exist. As you mentioned, there's a wealth of projects going on already, testing different types of engines, testing different types of fuels. What we really need to see over the next 5 to 10 years is testing on a commercial scale, testing end-to-end, from the fuel provision to the cargo owner, and really understanding the commercials of running operations on a commercial scale with zero-emission fuels. And that's the objective that we have set for ourselves. So I'm going to go to the next slide and then jump directly to the following one. So the way we've been thinking about those end-to-end pilots is that we really need to understand who needs to get involved. And it's obviously way more complex to test a technology from throughout the whole value chain than it is to test it at a particular level of the value chain, for instance, at the level of the vessel. Because once you look at it from a value chain perspective, you need way more players involved, way more stakeholders involved, and that obviously makes it more complex to find agreements across that pool of stakeholders. We've been mapping that value chain and really identifying who needs to be involved with some key critical stakeholders that need to be involved in all cases, and others that will vary depending on the pilot, depending on the fuel that we're considering, depending on the segment of shipping, be it container ship or be it bunkering and other segments of shipping as well. So who are the critical players? The marine fuel producer is a critical one. The bunkering supplier is a critical one. Vessel operators, vessel owners as well. The cargo owner is actually a critical one as well, and I will come back to why in a minute. So here's the value chain we need to mobilize to really trigger investment in end-to-end pilots. Next slide, please. So we've started by focusing on two critical options, and the blueprint focuses on two options that we believe that the findings will apply in different ways to a much broader set of fuel options. We focused on ammonia and on methanol as two test cases, if you want, of what the economics of an end-to-end value chain pilot would look like. And when you look at the overall economics, what you rapidly find out is that the majority of the investment, the majority of the capex, isn't happening at the level of the vessel, isn't happening at the level of bunkering. It is actually in fuel production, where you need the most investment to really scale up zero-emission shipping, is in the production of zero-emission fuels. So that was a first major findings of the report. Next slide. The second major finding then is that actually capex, if you combine the capex across the whole value chain, is only a very small portion of the total cost of zero-emission shipping in the end. The bulk of the cost of an end-to-end pilot comes from your feedstock for the production of your fuel. In the case of green ammonia, in the case of green methanol, most of that is electricity costs. So up to 70% of your full cost is fuel, is electricity cost. And then your cost of fuel can represent more than 90% of the total cost of your zero emission pilot once you run it through all the way to the vessel operator. So where the cost comes from is really the fuel, which explains why when we've tried then looking at what are the cost lowering options we could figure out, we have put a particular focus on fuel production. Because if you reduce the cost of your fuel, then it benefits the rest of the value chain. The other key elements that we have realized by running the economics of such a pilot is that all of the cost differential is particularly important for the vessel operator. It can be 3 times as costly to operate a zero-emission vessel than it is to operate it on HFO. Actually, when you run that through to the cost on the retail price of consumer goods, it is very tiny because transport costs are a very small proportion of the total cost of a good. Let's say a pair of shoes, you could compare it to a smartphone as well. It is a very small segment, which means that even if the cost of shipping was multiplied by 3, the impact on the cost of a consumer good would not be much more than 1%, which makes us very optimistic about the ability of the maritime sector to partner up with consumer goods companies to pass through that cost all the way to the end consumer. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Next slide. So we've really deep dived with the community of the Getting to Zero coalition on what were the options to lower the costs and also to de-risk investment in the first wave of zero-emission pilots. Focusing first on fuel production, because as I said, this is really where the bulk of the cost is concentrated. We found out that there were 5 major game changers that could be pursued by first movers to significantly lower the cost of fuel, of zero-emission fuels for the maritime industry. And they fall into 2 big buckets. One are techniques and tools to reduce the electricity cost, the electricity price. And you can do that through 3 ways. You can just choose locations to produce your fuel that has cheap access to renewable electricity because they have a very high amount of renewable energy potential. You can also agree on long-term corporate PPAs with electricity providers, which provides you with greater certainty on your cost of electricity and lower cost of electricity long-term. And governments can also play a role by providing tax exemptions and waivers on network costs to lower the cost of grid electricity for the fuel provider. These are levers to lower electricity costs. In parallel, you can also lower your investment, especially your investment in hydrogen capex, by doing 2 things. One is repurposing existing infrastructure and existing ammonia plants, in particular in the case of ammonia. The second is to really seize opportunities to buy equipment at the very least cost. And we know from studies from Bloomberg and others that Chinese electrolyzers are currently expected to be much lower cost than Western electrolyzers. And so for first movers, there might be an option to go purchase those least cost equipment in order to reduce the cost of fuel and therefore benefit the rest of the value chain. So these are really the game changers. In addition to that, one could obviously benefit from public support to investments from governments. And it's particularly important, again, at fuel level, given that the cost of fuel runs down the whole value chain. And there is also an interesting opportunity, but we've qualified it as a high-hanging fruit because it's a bit more complex to organize and will probably be lengthier to organize, to partner up with other sectors and create industrial clusters, especially industrial clusters relying on hydrogen production, where several sectors who will use hydrogen in different forms, for instance, shipping, aviation, and different industrial sectors, could partner up to jointly build the fuel infrastructure, share infrastructure costs, diversify offtake risk for the fuel provider, and also enable them to access lower cost industrial electricity prices, because the amount of electricity required for those different sectors combined would be higher. So these are the different cost lowering mechanisms that we've identified at the fuel production stage. Next slide. When we then turn to the other two major stages of end-to-end pilot, we have a slightly lower number of cost-lowering strategies that we could pursue. And what's very important to understand is that those cost-lowering strategies will be extremely important to make a pilot attractive for a bunkering supplier or for a vessel operator, even if they actually have quite a small impact on the final cost of zero-emission shipping and on the total cost of the pilot. But for the bunkering supplier or for the vessel owner and operator, those investments in particular are quite significant in themselves. And so support to lower the cost of those investments is particularly important. And they can take different form. For the bunkering level, the most efficient option is to just reuse existing infrastructure when it is available. Repurpose existing ammonia barges as bunkering vessels, for instance. Repurpose existing ammonia infrastructure in ports as storage for bunkering services. So that's a first layer. Second layer, and this is something that is already done in some cases for LNG, so it could be replicated for other fuels, using truck-to-ship fueling rather than have to invest in a bunker vessel itself. And that can obviously be an option for the first wave of projects. It will probably not be a long-term option, but for the first wave of projects, it can lower the cost quite significantly. And then again, public support mechanisms to investment. I think it's important to flag to governments that there are three major types of investment that they need to support to actually support first movers across the shipping industry. And it's investment in your fuel production infrastructure, investment in your bunkering facility, and investment, and I'm coming to that now, in the engines and the equipment required on ship. Those are the three major areas of investment that government support should flow to be able to support first movers. And investing in only one of those three buckets would actually not be as powerful as investing in those three buckets at the same time. At the vessel operator level, in addition to public support, one could also imagine one-off subsidies for operating costs, so not only for CapEx, but also for OpEx, in particular for one-off costs like retraining of the workforce. And finally, the key element will be, but again, we've classified that as a high-hanging fruit, to find ways of ensuring that the cost differential between zero-emission fuels and HFO is reduced progressively. And that should go through, in due time, IMO regulation. But we know, and I think the last signals from the IMO discussions weren't extremely good. So findings, voluntary ways as well of reducing that cost differential through a carbon levy and fee-based system would be particularly interesting. So these are the cost-lowering strategies at each stage of a pilot. Next slide. What we have then realized when compiling all of those strategies, both the game changers and the quick wins, is that the total cost of a pilot, of a first mover commercial scale pilot, could be reduced by up to 50%. It's very significant if you were able to leverage all of those levers at fuel production level, bunkering level, and vessel level. And the bulk of that cost reduction can come from fuel production. And so hence the importance of really focusing on that particular step in the value chain. Next slide. But beyond cost, there's also a range of risks that might decrease the willingness and appetite of first movers to invest in pilots. And we also need to address those risks to also lower the cost of capital that first movers will face. Those risks are of three categories. Technology risks, because some of those new fuels haven't been completely tested yet. And their collaboration across the value chain to fast-track technology evaluations is really key. You have regulatory risks, because some of the safety standards for the use of those new marine fuels haven't been agreed yet. And again, here, cross-value chain collaboration to fast-track domestic regulations and enable the first wave of zero-emission pilots is really important. But the most critical risk for first movers is the commercial risk, the offtake risk. And that offtake risk exists at each stage of the value chain. Your zero-emission maritime fuel provider is producing a fuel that is costlier than HFO, and therefore has a risk that it doesn't find consumers at bunkering level. The bunkerer, also providing a fuel at a higher cost than HFO, might face the risk that ship operators wouldn't buy that fuel. And the ship operator would, if using zero-emission fuels, provide a service that is higher cost to the cargo owner and faces the risk that the cargo owner doesn't want to actually take on that cost. And that commercial risk is really what is slowing down progress at this point in time. And the solution to that risk that is passed through all the way through the value chain to the cargo owner is to actually find agreements that go all the way back from the cargo owner to the fuel provider through a chain of offtake agreements at a green premium that cargo owners could start, because as mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the cost of zero-emission shipping for a cargo owner, when you run it through to the cost of its product, and when you compare it to other cost elements in the cost of a consumer good, is quite small. So if the cargo owner is ready to step up and to absorb some of that cost, and through offtake agreements with ship operators, really provide some certainty to the ship operator that this cost can be passed through, then that ship operator will be much more willing to enter in this type of offtake agreements with the bunkering supplier and the bunkering supplier with the fuel provider. So we really need that chain of offtake agreements to lower the risks and make the commercial model of a zero-emission shipping really work. Next slide. But what's very interesting is that if you actually apply all of the cost-lowering strategies that we've spoken about earlier, you reduce the amount that would need to be passed through to the end consumer quite significantly. So through the cost lowering mechanisms that we've described, you actually make the commercial agreements and that chain of offtake agreements that I've described much easier to put together, because the cost to the cargo owner would be much lower through that improved economic model than it would have been on a normal basis based on a standard green ammonia pilot in this case. Next slide. So what did we take out of this analysis? We've identified 8 major levers that the industry leaders, the first movers in the maritime sector, and governments can really pursue to unlock the first wave of commercial scale pilots. And I will run through them right now. There's much more granularity in the blueprint, and we look forward to discussing that granularity with the community over the coming weeks and months. In terms of the industry leaders themselves, 5 major things to do. One is join forces to fast-track technology trials and regulatory approvals, which are fundamental to just enable the commercial scale pilots to happen. Second major step, choose pilot locations that offer privileged access to low-cost renewable electricity and hydrogen, and choose all other options that enable you to reduce the cost of renewable electricity and hydrogen, which then go into your cost of zero-emission fuel. Third layer, seize every opportunity to repurpose and retrofit existing infrastructure and assets. This is true at fuel provision level, true at bunkering level, true at vessel level. The more you repurpose, the lower your capex, the lower the cost. Fourth major lever, co-investment in critical equipment. At bunkering and vessel levels, the capex is actually not that big in comparison with the capex that you need at fuel provider level, but it can be very significant for one single player. But all players in the value chain, including equipment manufacturers, including fuel providers, including port authorities, have an interest in really getting those technology dimensions right. And so co-investment can be a way of sharing costs and sharing risks across the value chain for those critical levels at bunkering and vessel level that are of interest to get right for the whole value chain. And then final step, form consortiums with key stakeholders, including cargo owners, to set up that chain of offtake agreements that will benefit everyone from the ship operator to the fuel provider. So these are industry levers. But industry alone will not be able to crack it. It will be much more difficult to crack it if there's no support to investment. Hence, the 3 major priorities that we've identified for governments on the next slide. Priority number 1 is to provide targeted investment support in the form of direct subsidies and of different forms of concessional and preferential loans to the value chain. And again, as I said earlier, this needs to be done for vessel operators and investment in engines, fuel storage. It also needs to be done at bunkering level and at fuel production level. And that's very important if we want to really improve the economics of zero-emission shipping. The second major lever, facilitate access of the maritime sector to low-cost electricity by investing at pace and at scale in renewable electricity provision, but also, as mentioned earlier, exempting marine zero-emission fuel providers from some of the taxes that are currently applied to electricity. And then final step, create a mechanism that effectively contributes to bridging the cost differential between zero-emission marine fuel costs and HFO. This can be a carbon price, this can be forms of subsidies. There are different ways of doing that. The most important thing is that there are levers that can be actioned at national level before they are actioned at IMO level. And given the pace at which IMO negotiations are currently going, very important for national governments to also take their responsibilities and create those mechanisms that would benefit first movers, even before IMO regulations actually enable us to extend the benefit of those regulations to the global industry. So let me stop here. I'm very glad to have done this work with the Global Maritime Forum. We're obviously very interested in seeing how this blueprint can support the next wave of pilots, especially inform governments in how they support the next wave of pilots. And I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Faustine, for this excellent presentation, and a great thank you to your team for all the work you put into making the report. And again, I think it's, as you said, there are a lot more details in the report than you could touch upon in this short time we've given you. So I would just encourage anyone that found the presentation interesting to read the report and dive into it. There's a lot more granular details and a lot more to explore. Also, given time, we won't have time to do Q&A sessions with Faustine in plenary now, but we have analysts from the Energy Transitions Commission monitoring the chat. So if you have questions to the presentation and to the content of the report, please write those questions in the chat, and they will seek to answer as many of those questions as they can. My name is Kasper Søgaard. I'm head of research at the Global Maritime Forum. I've been part of all the work of the First Movers work stream is supporting the work, and I think what I'm really excited about today, and also in terms of being the moderator for the panel session, is to see how the report that has been produced can actually be transformed from a blueprint into real action that can have an impact on the ground and help us get to get the first commercial scale demonstration projects going. To do this, we are very happy to have a panel of industry leaders that will help talk about how they see the opportunities, the barriers, and the potential action we can take either as individual companies, organizations, or collectively to make those commercial scale pilots possible within the next 5 years. So I will introduce our panels in the order in which we will invite them to speak. Some of you can probably identify the order we present them in, because it's very much built on the value chain that Faustine has shared with us, going all the way from the fuel production all the way to the end. So our first panelist is Ben Taylor.
Yeah, good morning.
Ben is Vice President of Strategy Carbon Architecture at Shell, and Shell has done a lot of work on how to decarbonize shipping, and earlier this year came out with a call to ramp up climate ambition for shipping, calling for net zero in 2050 target to be adopted at the IMO. Ben has also personally been involved in the work of the First Movers Coalition, First Movers workstream, and he was actually part of the group that earlier this year identified the need for developing such a blueprint. So very happy to have you on the panel, Ben. Thank you for joining us. Our second panelist is Erik van der Schans. Erik is Director of Environmental Management at the Port of Rotterdam. The Port of Rotterdam is the largest seaport in Europe, and in addition to being the largest port in Europe, the Port of Rotterdam is also home to one of the largest chemical industrial hubs in Europe, and thus a prime location for the future production of zero-emission fuels for shipping. And the Port of Rotterdam has also a very ambitious climate agenda and are involved in a number of lower zero-emission initiatives, both related to fuel production and to shipping. So welcome, Erik. Very happy to have you join the panel. Our third panelist is Charis Plakantonaki. Charis is Chief Strategy Officer at Star Bulk Carriers. Star Bulk is a global ship manager that owns and operates dry bulk vessels, and Star Bulk is also actively exploring opportunities to reduce the carbon footprint of the fleet, including the potential for using zero-emission fuel together with other stakeholders. So welcome very much, Charis. Our fourth industry panelist is Rob Stevens. Rob is Vice President, Ammonia Energy and Shipping Fuel at Yara. Yara is one of the world leaders in the production of ammonia, and as such also a large shipping customer, because I think at the global level around 20 million tons of ammonia are actually being shipped on ships already today. Yara is also actively engaged in a number of green ammonia projects, both in Europe and in Australia, and they're working with shipping and energy stakeholders to look at the potential for introducing green ammonia as a marine fuel. So thank you very much for joining us today, Rob. In terms of your interventions, I would like to ask each of us, seen from your perspective and your positioning in the value chain, to give your take on what are the most promising opportunities for first mover projects, what are the most important barriers that we need to address, and what are the actions that we can take either as companies or collectively to actually move this agenda forward. So over to you, Ben, to give us your remarks. And just as a piece of information, if you have questions to the panelists, please put them in the chat. We will be monitoring it, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss a few of those questions. So questions to the panelists, please put them in the chat, and then over to you, Ben.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Casper, and also thanks to Faustine for, I think, a fascinating presentation and a great report that is being launched today that will help move the industry forward, I think. I think looking at the kind of the challenge and where can we work and what do we need to do, there's kind of two words that come to mind. First word for me will be momentum, and the second word is partnerships. And I think on momentum, it's building strongly within the shipping sector. I think the report today, the GMF as a whole, and things like the Sea Cargo Charter, which came out only a couple of weeks ago, are great examples of the momentum that's now building within the sector. And if I think back to February when we first met, people felt there was some momentum beginning to happen then, but it just seems to be accelerating all the time. That momentum is going to be really important, but it's also really important that we look to see what's happening with the sector. So I think we're seeing countries also developing their own net zero targets, commitments and plans. For example, many nations have now built some hydrogen strategy and hydrogen plans that as a shipping community, we've also got to look at how we take advantage of those and work with those. So momentum within the sector and also momentum across sectors is going to be important. If we're going to build the infrastructure at the scale that's needed for the shipping community, it also needs to be on the back of the scale that's needed for other communities, such as the industry sector, commercial road transport, etc. So as Faustine said, to build that in a cost-effective fashion. In Shell, we're already starting to do some of that. We announced last week as we were doing our Q3 update, around 3 world-scale large electrolyzers that we're considering at the moment. Those are all based on industry and potentially commercial road transport operations, but of course will actually spin off and create benefits for the shipping community with hydrogen being developed there as well. Finding the places of intersection for those, particularly ports, where they may end up being located, is also going to be hugely important for the industry. For that momentum to continue, though, I think we also need to really start to unblock some of the barriers that still exist. And the upcoming IMO strategy review is going to be critical. I think critical at driving some near-term investments in R&D and piloting, etc., but also in the longer term in setting a really ambitious plan to get the sector to net zero. I think there's a real risk at the moment that we're seeing countries developing their net zero plans, China with its recent commitment, and Japan and Korea, as Michael mentioned in his introduction. And if we end up in a space where all the land-based geographies have moved to net zero in 2050, 2060 timeframe, but the trade between it isn't, then I think we'll have failed as a shipping community. So momentum is important. Removal of barriers for those to keep that momentum going is important. And then finally, it's about partnerships. I think we are seeing that we all need to lean in to this journey, and we all need to lean in and take part in developing the right infrastructure and understanding how to operate in a net zero world. Each part of the shipping value chain is going to change. I think whether we're a fuel provider, whether we're a port, whether we're a shipbuilder, an engine manufacturer, an operator, somebody who's moving their goods on our ships, a charterer, we're all going to be doing something differently in a net zero world than we're doing today. So all of us coming into the way we're scaling this and taking part in the development of it is going to be important. Each of us, I think, will be able to see opportunities in that space as well as problems. And each of us needs to lean in, I think, with our resources, our assets, and also our money to make that happen. That is challenging because it's economically challenging times, but I'm sure if we continue with the momentum we've got and the approach to partnerships that we're already seeing and work with governments and regulators to help us with that, we'll be able to find a way forward quickly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Momentum, partnership, leaning in and making sure that governments have the attention of the need to also decarbonize the trade between major geographical players, or really good takeaways. Thank you so much for sharing. Eric, from the port perspective, what are you seeing as the barriers and opportunities and potential action?
Thank you, Casper, for asking that question. But first, I would really like to congratulate Faustine with, I think, the really very important, but also great work that she did, and also how she summarized it. It's really important to share these insights because it's a big, audacious plan that we have as a world. And it's like my previous speaker also said, there is momentum and we need to build on partnerships. And just to highlight a couple of them a little bit more, and that's, I think it's really important to see that the transition of the maritime sector can only be successful when the fuel sector is able to deliver. And it's a very complicated sector because there you see that there will be also a lot of competition for the fuels they will produce, hydrogen, ammonia, to other sectors as well. And the stepping up requirements for those industries are perhaps even bigger than for the maritime industry. So I'm very pleased to see that, for example, at the port of Rotterdam, we start to develop the capacities for electrolyzers step by step now, and also to feed them with renewable energy. I think that's a little bit left in the out of the equation that we've seen today. But even if you are able to produce ammonia or hydrogen, you should produce it from renewable sources. And there's also a very big step up and ramp up necessary. But we see those steps taking place step by step, and that's really important. But then the next step for the maritime industry, especially, I think it is really to get it to a place where they can use it. And there, next to all the issues that I've heard already, I think it's also important to understand that the trade lanes should get a little bit more focused on. Perhaps as a step-by-step approach, because yes, we can do something in the port of Rotterdam, but what for ships that are navigating from Rotterdam to China and back? Where will they bunker only in Rotterdam, or like they sometimes do today, or will they bunker more frequently in the future and then need to have more infrastructure and accessibility to fuels along the trade lane? So that's why we launched something like the World Port Climate Action Program, where with 12 other leading ports, we really look at piloting along those trade lanes with alternative fuels. I think that's really, really very important. And the other thing that I cannot stress enough is that every drop of energy that is not needed doesn't need to be transitioned. So there still is a lot to be gained in energy efficiency of ship designs, energy efficiency of navigating on the seas, and also in alternative propulsion systems. I saw my good friend Jean-Paul Raffini ask a question on sailing. And yes, wind-propelled ships can play a role also in driving down this transition cost and complications. So it's really taking this step of getting the fuels to the ship, but also making sure that the amount of energy needed is limited as much as possible. And also there we need the same partnerships along the trade lines.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think the point about shipping is not just about a point source, it's about a network, and we need to build that network effect to really have that impact. I think a really important point about energy efficiency: a drop of fuel not needed is a drop of fuel we don't need to transition. That will reduce the cost. And then I think the point about all of this, especially when we talk about green ammonia and methanol, is dependent on the rollout of renewable electricity, because otherwise we won't see those climate benefits. So it's a big beast that we're tackling, and I think again reinforcing the need for partnership and building on momentum and the great work that you're also doing with other ports in terms of developing that thinking. And I think that to me is one of the really positives, that so many actions are already happening. So there is definitely momentum to build on. Charis Starball, you're a ship owner operator, and you will at the end of the day potentially need to make investments in new engines, new ships. And how does this transition look from that perspective?
Thank you, Casper. It is a pleasure to be on this panel today, and on behalf of Starbulk, I would like to congratulate the Energy Emissions Commission for putting together this comprehensive blueprint, which will hopefully help drive the first wave of zero-emission vessel projects. Now, as to your question on concrete actions that the company should take to catalyze large-scale demonstration projects, at the shipping company level, it is important to start by defining the level of ambition and the relevant decarbonization strategy. For example, at Starbulk, we have laid out a vision to lead by example when it comes to participating in research and development for new technologies and for zero-emission fuels. We acknowledge the magnitude of the challenge and the fact that Starbulk alone cannot pull this off. Hence, we actively seek to develop partnerships with other industry players and to create alliances where each constituent may contribute their part. We believe that shipping companies that will engage early on in demonstration projects will benefit from the partnerships which will be formed, but also from the technology leadership and the operational knowledge sharing. And this should give first movers a competitive advantage as the maritime industry undertakes this transition globally. And for a dry bulk company of our size, it is critical to actively engage in projects so as to better understand the opportunities and be ready to adopt them if and when it makes sense to actually use those on our ships. Now, of course, there are important barriers to address from our company's position when it comes to making large-scale demonstration projects possible. As a ship owner, especially when it comes to new zero-emission fuels, we are concerned with the technical and safety-related aspects that need to be in place before adopting new fuels and engine technologies on a vessel. For example, methanol, ammonia, hydrogen. Although they are already being transported by ships, they are either more flammable or more toxic than heavy fuel oil. And in that respect, classification societies and regulatory authorities will have to play their part here in expediting the development of the safety and fuel handling standards for any new marine fuel, both in ports but also at sea. And of course, training our crews on board as well as the office personnel on storage and handling of zero-emission fuels will also be critical. Another major barrier for us is related to the economic viability of investing in new vessels or retrofitting existing vessels. As Faustine has already mentioned, the cost differential between zero-emission fuels and heavy fuel oil is estimated to be very high, and ship owners will be reluctant to invest in new technologies and buy fuel at a significant premium without having assurances that there is a market that will be willing to pay for the additional cost. Therefore, de-risking of any ship investment is important, for instance, through long-term charter contracts between us and cargo owners that would be paying a premium for green shipping and would then pass on the increased fuel cost to the customer. As per Faustine's presentation, again, it is estimated that the potential cost of the end consumer will be relatively low, given that freight costs are a very small portion of consumer good prices. At the same time, policymakers can facilitate such charter agreements by creating mechanisms and economic incentives to bridge the cost gap between zero-emission fuels and HFO. And of course, governments may also provide targeted investment support when it comes to new building vessels and retrofits. Therefore, at a more collective level and perhaps within the scope of initiatives such as the Getting to Zero Coalition, it is critical to help raise awareness among governments and cargo owners about the role that they will need to play in order to build an economically viable business case for zero-emission shipping. And I need to stress that shipping companies will only be making those long-term investments if the economics make sense. And this will require support from the rest of the value chain. So in that respect, it is also important to engage with policymakers at an international level so as to participate in the dialogue on the necessary policy mechanisms, whether to subsidize zero-emission fuels and bring down the fuel costs for ship operators, or to finance investments in zero-emission vessels and vessel retrofits, for example, through direct grants or concessional loans.
Thank you, Charis. I think the point about commercial viability or economic viability as being the key requisite that we need to have in order for shipping companies to move forward, combined with what you stressed about the need to ensure safety, that the technology works, and that we have the crews that are trained to handle this. I think those are really, really important points as moving forward, and also stressing the role of governments in order to do this. One question I have for you, and that is also when you dive into the report, one of the challenges I think with the bulk and the bulk segment is of course the tramp nature of the trade that makes it more difficult to access a single point of new zero-emission fuels. So how do you prepare for that? What are the kinds of projects that you're engaging in to prepare yourself for that future?
Well, you're very right, Casper. Starbulk is a dry bulk ship owner and operator, which makes it more challenging for us to engage in first mover projects due to the tramp nature of our vessel trade, whereas, for example, container ships are easier as the routes are more predictable, hence bunkering infrastructure and fuel availability are less of a barrier. Irrespective of that, Starbulk is already involved in first mover projects. A good example being the SIP-FC project, which aims to install the world's first high-power ammonia fuel cell on a vessel. This is a project which is being run by a consortium of 14 European companies and institutions and has been awarded 10 million euros funding from the European Union. This project specifically will start with a large ammonia fuel cell retrofit on an offshore vessel, allowing it to sail solely on the clean fuel, and thereafter will replicate the experience from the demonstrator to additional vessel types to explore the path to larger systems. So this project is a good example on the importance of starting the testing at a small scale before adopting technologies in larger vessels in deep sea shipping, but also on the importance of engaging first movers from across the shipping value chain and having government funding to enable the research and development.
Thank you, Charles. That's a very good example of how you can engage in first mover projects. Just again, if you have questions to the panelists, please write them in the chat. I think we'll probably have time for one or two questions at the end after Rob's intervention. So Rob, Yara is a potential fuel supplier, but you're also a large cargo owner. So you said the kind of two different pieces of the value chain. So what's the perspective from Yara in terms of decarbonizing shipping?
Yeah, so the perspective of Yara is of course driven by ammonia. We by origin are a crop nutrition company, but we're globally interlinked through our ammonia trade. So 200 million tons of ammonia being produced worldwide. Of that, 10%, 20 million is being shipped. We as Yara ship 5 million tons of these volumes. So what is being indicated as a barrier on shipping fuel infrastructure, we do see as an opportunity, because safe supply and logistics of ammonia is proven already at scale. So this could be a good starting point at security of supply for shipping fuel. Linked to that, I emphasize the word safe. So not only production but storage, but also logistics is safely done. And already the last 7 decades, safety standards are being shared within industry. So that would be a good starting point and therefore an opportunity to bring this knowledge on board our ship. Linked to this existing infrastructure, current ammonia, therefore, with some overcapacity in the world, could be a good de-risking to start the first projects. Given the fact that even gray conventional ammonia is a zero-emission fuel on board already. If we then look to the barriers to move into the future on zero-emission production of ammonia, we embarked on several projects. That's where we have our learning on solar, offshore wind, and hydropower-based hydrogen and therefore ammonia production. So that's our learning curve we hope to facilitate. As was indicated earlier, the more people, the more projects on green hydrogen scale up will happen, the earlier the learning curve and the cost of electrolyzer manufacturing comes down. The main barrier, as was indicated in the introduction of the blueprint as well, is indeed the cost of green production. And in order to move forward there, scale is needed, but the first projects for the first movers need to be supported by governments, by policies, but also by funding. The earlier we get funding, the shorter the period will be on scaling up and making the green ammonia, the green fuel, in the end cheaper, which was one of the bigger barriers as indicated in the report as well. And ideally, this could be done by cost of difference for the first large-scale projects, as well as providing consumer incentives to start creating a market pool. So if we link that then to one of the topics on where we could see first movers happening, it could be Europe, because of the Green Deal, because of the innovation projects of common European interest, so focusing on hydrogen, which could be a methodology to fund the first large-scale green ammonia. On the other side, it could be joining forces between ammonia as fuel, as ammonia as energy carrier, for example, between Australia and Asia, to create scale the quickest.
Thank you, Rob. Just a quick question. As you mentioned, you're transporting 5 million tons of ammonia every year. Are you looking into the potential of actually introducing ammonia as a fuel on the vessels that you charter or operate?
We started scratching the surface on that. It's more and more a realization that if an ammonia carrier fueled by ammonia would facilitate the speed of implementing ammonia fuel chips, is something that needs to be explored, and that's also the reason that we have chosen within the No Gaps project from the Getting to Zero coalition to evaluate that route in collaboration in the full value chain.
Thank you very much, and I think interesting point about using the learnings that you have as ammonia industry in terms of handling this safely as one example of how we can facilitate learnings across industries. And I think this was a point that you also made, and in terms of the need to collaborate and expand the stakeholders involved. That is, I think, as a concrete example. One thing I wanted to just as the final question before we need to close to pose to all of you. I think there's been a lot of talk about government intervention, and I think we've heard a lot about the need for international regulation, especially in long term, but we also heard from Rob the potential of sort of having regional carrots to kind of accelerate. How do you see that interplay between sort of the national, the regional level as perhaps accelerating this, and then look at what can be done at the international level to also drive that? What is the interplay between the domestic, regional, and the international, global? Any thoughts?
So the indications now from our perspective is that indeed the link of how to say the CO2 reduction within Europe, if we could link that to shipping industry and such. I think that would be a wonderful message towards the policymakers to make that happen. And my understanding is that the European Union nowadays is also looking into the emissions close to shore. So in principle, there could be that locally joint effort for shipping and land-based industry could jointly reduce the CO2 emissions with that geographical area on CO2 reductions. So the indications are that shipping and other measures, could be under one umbrella. But how that will end, is still onshore. That's the EU being, trying to detail out the targets of the 50 to 60% of CO2 reduction.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to add. I think that it's clearly, I think from for an international trade business, I think the more we can get a single aligned global system, the better. I think if we end up with a series of geographical systems and the complexity that creates for both fuel providers, the whole value chain would make it very, very difficult. But I do see an approach where potentially you're going to get first movers, not just amongst industry, but amongst regions and governments as well, that can then lead to that international coalition again and an international alignment, which will be important to enable just smooth world trade.
So takeaway, we need the first movers to bring it both across the industries and across the global scale if we are really to succeed at making the energy transition for shipping. And so the end goal is very clear, but there might be intermediate steps where first movers need to pave the way both on the government side and also on the industry side. Our time is up. I would like to thank all of you for joining this panel and sharing your insights. I think there's a lot of learnings, and I think especially this message about building on the momentum, building on all the good work that's being done, and building on the partnerships that have already been established and expanding them. I think that's a very encouraging message. And then also the need to send a clear message to governments that we really need you to make this shipping transition possible. So with those words, thank you so much for joining the session. Again, we hope that you will enjoy exploring and understanding the report even further, and we look forward to discussing it in a more interactive session in the context of the Getting to Zero Coalition work. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.